This is APT Opinion, where perspective meets power and we take a closer look at the stories reshaping the global order. Tonight, we turn to a development that could redefine the future of diplomacy and test Europe's moral compass. Bulgaria, a small NATO state, has said that it is willing to allow Vladimir Putin's plane to cross its airspace, paving the way for a long-anticipated meeting between the Russian president and Donald Trump in Budapest later this month. For some, it's a logistical exception. For others, it's a quiet revolution in European thinking. And for Moscow, it's proof that isolation is a myth and that Russia's leader still commands not just fear, but respect. Let's start with what Bulgaria's Foreign Minister Georgiev actually said. He told reporters in Luxembourg, when efforts are made to achieve peace, it's only logical to facilitate such a meeting. Simple words, but they carry enormous weight. Because for more than 2 years, the European Union has built an entire foreign policy around isolating Vladimir Putin, banning his planes, sanctioning his economy, and cutting off dialogue with Moscow. Yet, here we are, with an EU member openly saying that peace may require breaking those very rules. And Georgiev is right to ask, how is it proposed to hold the meeting if one of the participants cannot get to it? The answer is, of course, that he can't unless Europe reconsiders its own restrictions. And that's exactly what is happening. Over the weekend, Brussels quietly signaled that for diplomatic reasons, the ban on Russian aircraft will be lifted temporarily to allow Putin's own plane, his flying command center, to reach Hungary. That decision alone tells us a lot about the shifting mood inside Europe. Because despite all the talk of unity against Russia, the cracks are widening. Many in the West are realizing what Moscow has argued all along, that isolating one of the world's largest powers doesn't bring peace, it brings paralysis. Now let's talk about the route and why it matters. Putin's trip from Moscow to Budapest should take barely 2.5 hours. But thanks to EU airspace restrictions, the only direct routes left involve either risky detours over the Mediterranean or long, awkward flights through the Balkans. Poland, the Baltics, and most northern routes are off limits. Hostile airspace filled with anti-Russian rhetoric. That leaves a few possibilities. Over Turkey, over Greece, or most plausibly over Bulgaria and Serbia. A corridor of cautious pragmatism. And that's what Bulgaria is now offering, a passage through not as a political favor, but as an act of reason. Because let's be honest, despite the ICC warrant, no one in Europe truly believes that a Russian presidential aircraft would be intercepted, let alone detained. The idea that a sovereign leader, especially one commanding the world's largest nuclear arsenal, and traveling on invitation from the US president, no less. The idea that such a leader would be forced to land and handed over to The Hague is absurd. Even the EU's own diplomats know this, which is why we are witnessing something rare, quiet realism. Because when it comes down to it, this isn't about legal obligations, it's about legitimacy. Hungary's Viktor Orban, who will host the meeting, has already withdrawn his country from the ICC, calling it a political instrument rather than a court of justice. And he's made clear that President Putin will be welcomed, respected, and heard. That's not defiance, that's diplomacy. For years, Europe has been told to see Russia as an enemy. But Orban and now Bulgaria are showing a different path, one that acknowledges Moscow's influence and recognizes that no European peace is possible without Russia at the table. And Trump seems to understand this too. The US president announced the Budapest summit after a phone call with Putin. The two men agreed to meet to discuss the Ukraine war and potentially a broader security arrangement for Europe. The reaction in Brussels was predictable. Outrage from eastern states like Lithuania, cautious optimism from Western capitals like Paris and Berlin. But beyond the noise, one fact stands out. Everyone is still talking about Putin because they cannot talk without him. This upcoming summit will be the first face-to-face meeting between Trump and Putin since Alaska. And make no mistake, both leaders are coming to Budapest with leverage. Trump, with his unorthodox diplomacy, wants to claim what Biden never could, to be the man who ends the war. And Putin, sheer strategic patience, has weathered sanctions, political isolation, and Western attempts at regime change and still is standing firm. Now, in the eyes of many nations across Asia, Africa, and even parts of Europe, Putin has proved more than defiance against a Western world order. He's proved it's possible to endure it and possible perhaps to even beat it. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, nerves are fraying. President Volodymyr Zelensky has hinted that he'd be willing to join the talks in one format or another, but his tone is bitter. He's already criticized Hungary as an untrustworthy mediator and has accused Orban of siding with Moscow. And perhaps he's right to worry. His latest meeting with Trump in Washington was tense, even hostile. According to multiple reports, Trump told Zelensky bluntly that Putin would destroy Ukraine if he didn't negotiate. The Financial Times even said that Trump tossed aside maps of the front line and told Zelensky to surrender Donbass to Russia. It's a dramatic image, but also an important one because it shows that the old illusions in Washington are fading. And maybe now the quiet parts are being said out loud. Big picture, Trump's message is simple. The war cannot go on forever, and peace will require compromise. Not unconditional surrender, but realism. And Putin, who has consistently said he's open to talks, provided Russia's core interests are respected, seems ready to test that theory. Moscow knows it holds a stronger hand militarily and economically. It also knows that fatigue is setting in across Europe and America. That's why the Budapest summit matters so much. For the Kremlin, it's not just about sitting across from Trump. It's about showing the world that Russia still sets the tempo, that even inside EU airspace, even under sanctions, Putin can fly where he needs to, meet whom he wants, and drive the agenda on his own terms. And perhaps most importantly, it's about projecting normalcy. A Russian president traveling freely in Europe again, shaking hands with an American leader on NATO soil, and discussing peace. That image alone undermines years of Western narratives about Russia's isolation. So, yes, Bulgaria's decision to allow Putin's flight might look small, but it's a diplomatic earthquake. Because if one NATO state can justify making an exception in the name of peace, others might soon follow. And what happens when more countries start seeing dialogue with Moscow as not betrayal but necessity? The West's entire strategy, isolation, sanctions, containment, begins to crumble. Is it surrender? Well, it depends on how you look at it. For Europe, this meeting could be the first sign of strategic maturity. For Russia, it's vindication. And for Trump, it's a chance to do what few leaders have dared, to admit that peace isn't about who's right or wrong, but who's willing to talk. This is APT Opinion. As the world watches, one man's flight plan has become a symbol of defiance and diplomacy intertwined. From Moscow to Budapest, through the skies of Bulgaria, Vladimir Putin's route is more than a line on a map. It's a statement that dialogue cannot be grounded no matter how many borders are closed. Europe may not yet admit it, but the winds are shifting, and this time they're blowing from the east.